If you had a pencil and paper, you could keep track of everything in your life and do a good job. And if you wanted to write to somebody, you took the piece of paper and you wrote them a letter and sent it off. If you were keeping track of your money from the bank, you had your pencil and you did that. Now look what you do. My name is Judith Preble. I grew up like a block from this place, yes. North Lake, it was a really, really nifty place to grow up. We had the lake, we had a lot of fields to run around in, we had the golf course to play on. We'd go out there in the morning real early on the golf course and pick up all of the golf balls that the people the day before had shot into the weeds. And then we'd go back and we'd sell them the balls back after they came out to play. It was good. There were 4 children. We were spaced out pretty wide. I was the oldest. Then my sister Wendy was 7 years younger. Then Pat was 7 years younger than her. And then John was 2 years younger than her. So I was 16 years old and a senior in high school when John was born, which was pretty embarrassing to me because I'd wheel him around and people thought he was my baby. I didn't like that very much. I went to school when I was 3. My mother worked in Ann Arbor, and she would take me every morning to a nursery school and then a kindergarten. When I was 3 and 4, she would drop me off there every morning and pick me up every afternoon. So I was used to going to school from the age of 3. And then when I was 5, I think I was 5 or just 6, I started at North Lake Country School, which was about 2.5 miles from the house. In the school, it was fun. We were outdoors a lot of the time. The teacher was always busy, so when she was busy with one grade, the people in the other grades would play and do stuff outside, wherever. She didn't know what was going on a lot of the time. But it was fun. We had a lot of games that we played at recess. And Andy over the schoolhouse, he'd throw a ball over. The other people would try to catch it and then hit you with the ball. Since it was a softball, it was hard as a brick. It would hurt you bad. And then we played softball. And there were kids all the way from 5 and 6 years old up to 14 and 15 years old. And some of those big farm boys could take your head off with a baseball, hitting it at you or throwing it to you. It was cruel. But we would play against other country schools. We would travel over there or they'd come over. So that was real competition. It was a bad skill, but fun. Better than doing arithmetic. Well, living out here, it was pretty tough, unless the friend lived around here. And I didn't drive, of course, at that point. I wasn't old enough to drive till I was a senior in high school. So, unless you did friend things right after school, and then I had to get home some way, it was pretty hard that way. And to join any clubs or teams, that took some extra thinking to do that too. In 1955, I graduated from high school, from Chelsea. I went from North Lake School in the 8th grade, finished the 8th grade, to Chelsea in the 9th grade. And again, there weren't any buses out here. The buses came to the store up there. The country store was closed, so I had to walk from here to the country store. And your grandpa had to buy a lot up in that township for me to be allowed to ride the bus, which I hated riding the school bus. So I would go over to the Ford dealer after school where Uncle Don worked, selling cars, selling Fords. And I'd ride out. He lived out here, of course. He and Aunt Eleanor lived out here. And I'd much rather ride with him, even though I had to wait. And then when I did things like play basketball or anything extra, that was good, because I wouldn't have been able to be on the bus anyway. So I rode out with him. So that worked out. I think Wendy did that some, too. That was handy.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Well, I was pretty little. I understood we were at war, but I don't think I really knew what a war was. I didn't read the newspaper, and we didn't have the TV news like we have now. I remember we had a big old radio that stood on the floor. And I remember sitting, and other family members sitting and listening to President Roosevelt saying, we knew when he was going to give a speech, and he gave a speech and said that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and he declared war on the Japanese right at that time. Well, that was 1941. I would have been 3 years old at that. So I really, I didn't know. But there were neighbors who had relatives in the Army and stuff. And your grandpa, your great-grandpa, Jack, he worked down at Willow Run building bombers. And that kept him he got passed over for the draft. He didn't get drafted because of that. So we didn't really have any close relatives in the military at that time. I think he worked there about 2 or 3 years. We did have rationing. That's a good question. I someplace have an old ration book that I found. You had different books for different things. They were like stamps. And you keep the book. It had your name on it, and it would say, depending on your age, where you lived, whether you were a student or a parent or what, how much you were allowed to have. And they were rationing things like sugar, salt, different kinds of meat, whatever the military needed. We could only get certain amounts. Then they did things like tires, and you can imagine the metals and stuff. We collected tin foil, like off a piece of gum, and we'd roll it up in a ball and turn that into the teacher on certain days. There were some other things we collected like that to contribute to the war effort. And so that's really, I remember a guy coming around at night, going outside of people's houses to see if there were any lights on, because you weren't supposed to let your lights show outside in case the Germans were flying over. We didn't want him to know where the houses were, and that was his job. I enjoyed the time period when I was a kid. It was fun. It was fun. I used to kind of have a running contest with Granny. She thought I was a wild animal. Didn't want me out running around the neighborhood. She'd rather I work on the sewing machine or something. You can picture that, can't you? So I had the bedroom that was over a porch. And I could open the window, get out on the porch, and go down the eaves trough and leave the house before she even got up. And I'd play all day. We would swim across the lake. We would row. We would fish with no adults around. She didn't even know where I was. Wendy did pretty much the same thing. And so it was my job, I thought, to get out of the house as early as possible. So Granny wouldn't know where I was. And that way I could do whatever I wanted all day long.